This is the Fire These Times, and I'm your host, Ayoub. In this third season, we will be exploring internationalist solidarity, prefigurative politics, solarpunk, and how to tackle some of the most pressing challenges of our times. Each episode will be on one or more of these topics. But before getting into today's topic, I wanted to quickly tell you that you can support this podcast for as little as $2 or $5 a month on patreon.com/firethesetimes. That is patreon.com/firethesetimes. If you cannot donate, you can still support by sharing it with your friends and families and leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts. This helps it get more exposure and introduce it to more folks. That's it from me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode.
Hi everyone, and hi Joey. Thank you so much for having me on here. My name is Daniel. I live in Barcelona in Spain. I come from Argentina, to Russian and to British parents. And I've worked for the last decade, I guess, in the climate justice movement. I work as a writer, as a researcher, as an artist. And I guess my passion is for the intersections of historical memory, ecology, public health, and justice. What are the ways in which these come together? What are the ways in which we can find ways that these different streams can sing to each other? So yeah, that's where I come from.
And so far, you and I, other than just chatting on the side and being good friends and stuff, we did one thing publicly and, one thing publicly, whatever. One thing online and one thing offline. Let's start with that. I figured I think it would be a good thing to mention the Ukraine and Syria panel that I hosted some months ago. I don't remember when it was, as well as the trip that both you and I took to Coimbra in Portugal, because I think the themes of in the first case internationalism, in the second case climate in general, as well as the intersection of those two, which I think, especially in the second case, we kind of explored a bit more. They would kind of make a good, I think, kind of pillar in some sense to kind of anchor our conversation, if that makes sense.
Beautiful. Yeah, so I think we can tell the story of how we first came together. Your work has been phenomenal for so many years in terms of, I think, representing what I see as the highest internationalist spirit, the spirit of bringing people together from different experiences, but with parallel experiences as well, and finding their shared power in their common experience. I think at the time when the invasion of Ukraine began, obviously I felt a need, along with many others, to do what we could to support, but also to find ways in which conversations could be built that could bring people with existing experience and knowledge to the fore to speak across borders and start weaving together a stronger movement. I'm part of a collective called Post-Extractive Futures, which has at its core this ethos, right? The kind of key question that animates that collective is, what is it that we can do together that we can't do alone? And so, with a bunch of people, we put different Ukrainian and Syrian voices in conversation to talk about the shared experience of Russian imperialism among other imperialisms, but also about what does it mean to be in this position? What are the things that we can learn from each other? How do you confront certain forms of erasure and exclusion and hostility, especially from quote unquote progressive or false kind of allies in a way? But I think there's something that binds me and you is a shared political vision that it's important to erase the borders that have been imposed by geography or by politics, and to build, I think, other distinctions that are more important between justice and injustice, between solidarity and evasion. So yeah, I think that's a little bit about the Ukraine and Syria event that we did.
And what about the Coimbra one, for those who don't know?
Yeah, so in Coimbra we came together as part of, I guess, a pluriversal justice summer school. So this is pluriversal, for those hearing, it's a way of combining the words plurality and universe, the idea that the world should be one where different worlds fit, not just a mono world, a monoculture of a world. And so different academics and activists got together in Coimbra in the summer to discuss different visions of social, economic, and climate justice, and what these look like in a city, what these look like in rural environments. And so we also had the blessing to meet there, but also travel together there. I think this was something very beautiful. We share a love of slow travel, of another way of moving ecologically through the world. And I think that was also a beautiful, almost ritual of movement, is getting to know you through multiple days of traveling and learning about each other as the landscapes changed, and learning about the landscapes as we changed as well.
Exactly. I think in those two kind of, and thank you for the compliments, in those, the two, I don't know, events, if you want to call them that way, that we took part in, as well as the traveling from, in my case, from Geneva to Coimbra, and we met up in Barcelona, and then we continued to Coimbra together. For me, was a way of slowing down the world, if that makes sense. Especially the latter part, obviously, but the conversations as well. The Ukraine-Syria one, the Coimbra one, broadly speaking, as well. And what I mean by that, and maybe that's kind of the wrong metaphor, I'm not sure, but what I mean by that is that we live in a time where, and I think this is kind of becoming well known in the sense that we're saturated with information, but this isn't necessarily accompanied with more knowledge necessarily, or with a greater sense of self or peace with oneself or whatnot. There's actually quite a lot of confusion, quite a lot of anxiety, quite a lot of restlessness, I think it's fair to say at this point. And this isn't to say that, oh, you know, previous generations, it's not like a nostalgic reminiscing of how things were before the internet or whatever. It's more just like trying to, within phenomenology, which is just like this school of thought, there is this idea of bracketing. So you just pause, like you're literally bracketing an idea, let's say bracketing fear. And instead of going with what you think you know about fear, you just try and analyze objectively, quote unquote, what does fear do? How does it act upon you? What is, maybe it means like increased heart rate, maybe increased, whatever, stuff like that, blurry vision maybe. And that's not that dissimilar from kind of meditation practices, more broadly speaking. I think it's just more kind of a Western framework for it. But anyway, all of this to say that this has allowed me, and I think allowed you and allowed us together and individually and whatnot, to look at intersection between nominally opposed or maybe disconnected concepts and ideas, like the Ukraine and Syria one that we did. So the Ukraine and Syria one that we did, and I hosted it, was with two Syrian activists, writers, academics, and two Ukrainian activists and academics. And at first, like, for many people, the only thing that they would have in common is, well, the both of them oppose Russia, because Russia invaded Ukraine, obviously, and Russia continues to bomb Syria as well, and bombs Ukraine, obviously, as well. We're recording this towards late December, I should say, 2022. But the more they spoke, the more we kind of realized, all of us, and I think people in the chat as well, there was like a few hundred people attending, that there's actually quite a lot of more things in common. And the things that usually are in common are not necessarily very concrete, in the sense that, like, it might be a feeling, it might be an experience, usually an experience of feeling erased, for example, or not being prioritized in a discourse about your country, for example. And here we're referring to the pseudo-anti-imperialism, as we usually have been calling it, which I think has become a theme of this podcast, despite me. But yeah, so this is I threw like 10 different things at the same time to see what sticks. But I think this is how I like to have these conversations. And we have a few bullet points that we kind of focus on. But what are some of your thoughts and reflections on that first?
Oh, thank you so much for that fragrant reflection. There's so much there, but I kind of want to start with where you started, really, which is this idea of slowing down the world. Mm-hmm. I think, to me, ecology is something that I see as a way of relating to the world that is of deep urgency and importance. And it requires, I think, an urgency of slowness. You can't do the work required by ecological literacy without slowing down and listening and putting your feet in the earth of humility. And I think what ties so many of these conversations is in a culture of relentlessness, in a culture of immediacy, in a culture that values certainty in a particular kind of masculine, dogmatic way of thinking about the world. Deep ecological thinking, which reminds you of your smallness, reminds you of your humility, is deeply radical. Mm-hmm. And so I think whether we're talking about how to find solidarities between different communities around the world facing empire, facing oppression, facing occupation, facing war, or whether we're talking about what does it mean to cultivate a way of relating to the world around us that is more ecological. It comes down to slowing down and listening, and shedding. I think a disposition many of us have to anchor ourselves in certainty, and really becoming fluent in what it means to be deeply humble and slow. And I think I'm a student of this. I think I have a lot of work to shed in my discipline to become more patient, more slow, more humble. But I'm reminded by so many elders, by so many people that inspire me, that the real work of urgent activism isn't about maintaining one rhythm all the time. It's about being able to have multiple rhythms. Sometimes you need to be incredibly fast, and there's moments that necessitate urgency, but also sometimes in the urgency we have to be slow and we have to listen. And I was recently listening to an amazing podcast by the incredible Trisha Hersey. Some of you might know Trisha from the Nat Ministry, or also known as the Nat Bishop, an incredible academic, author, theologian. And Trisha's got this beautiful reflection on Harriet Tubman, right? Harriet Tubman as the legendary activist. I mean, there's so many, we could have 50 podcasts on Harriet Tubman, but Trisha's got this reflection that Harriet Tubman, who's doing some of the most urgent work in the world in terms of helping enslaved people flee from plantations, even in those times of intense urgency, had to listen to the earth, had to listen to the stars, had to listen to the water to know how to navigate their way out of oppression and find their way to safety. So even people doing the most quote unquote urgent, time-pressed, life-threatening work in the world require slowing down to plug into what's meaningful to help them in the quest for justice. So, yeah.
What's the name of the podcast?
Oh my goodness, I have to find the podcast for you, but I think Trisha Hersey's just published a book, which I think, if I'm not mistaken, is called Rest as Resistance. I haven't read it yet, but I think it's called Rest as Resistance, a manifesto.
Good, okay. So in what you were saying, I thought about what might seem, again, I think this is what we like to do often. We see two things that seem opposed, but they're actually not. And you mentioned like the urgency of slowness, and that's sort of the paradox, or at least at surface level, it might seem like a paradox, that the climate crisis or the ecological crisis is two things at the same time. It's very fast by geological standards, by Earth standards. It's a bit too slow by human standards at time, if that makes sense. But from our side, sort of in terms of how we react to it, there is this paradox that we need to be fast on certain things, reducing carbon, reducing all of that stuff, carbon emissions and everything else related to it. But at the same time, the problem is, at least to a significant extent, the speed of our world. And by speed, we mean especially the specific forms of neoliberal capitalism we live in, hyper-consumerism, extractivist economies, that sort of thing. And it kind of feels that it's almost like we're stuck in a downward spiral, if that's the correct metaphor. At the very least, we're stuck on some kind of like on a wagon, on a train that just keeps on going faster and faster and faster. And it's almost like the only thing that the train conductor knows how to do is to just go faster, just to see what happens. And it's almost like it's kind of it's not that way. Obviously, we know that our political decisions, we know that this isn't to sound conspiratorial or whatever. It just feels sometimes that way, that we're living in a world economy, right, that is almost like is no longer controlled by anyone, i.e. like it's the self-fulfilling prophecy of the magic hand of the market, right, the invisible hand of the market. It's obviously not that. We know governments are involved, we know all of these things are involved, but it sort of feels like no one is really steering that ship anymore. And that sense of I think what can come out of this feeling, eco-anxieties, helplessness, hopelessness, cynicism maybe, desperation, all of those things, I think those are very real emotions and real valid emotions as well. But they need to be kind of contextualized or maybe linked with one another, or with other struggles, other people's experiences and whatnot. Because otherwise, frankly, they just become overwhelming and they become very atomizing, right? Like you feel like there's this beautiful article shared today on thecut.com of I forgot the name of the author, but on like what did it feel like when she felt that she was having the world's burden on her own shoulders, and how she had to find a way to navigate that, to understand that it shouldn't be on any one person's shoulders, obviously. So that sort of thing. And in all of that, the two temporalities, as I think we might call them, of speed and slowness, another kind of apparent dichotomy, is something that I think the two of us are really into, which is futurisms and also the past. And the past can be hauntings, can be, I think, what you call it, biocultural memory, ecological heritage, and we can kind of play around with it to some, like in some ways. But talk to us a bit about how you think about maybe these two temporalities, if we can use that framework.
Such a beautiful question, Joey, and I can't wait to hear also your reflection. I think to me, since one thing that has struck me always, at least about the climate conversation, is the lack of often basic kind of historical memory. You know, why are we here? Like, how is it often in the way that the climate crisis is taught? And I think I appreciated this much more. I used to work and do kind of workshops in schools, and it's almost as if kids are told, we're at this kind of species-threatening crisis all of a sudden. And so there's no context on how did we get here? What level of ecological violence did it take to get to this point? It's just kind of the climate crisis as an apparition rather as a historical process, right? So I think dealing with memory is crucial for just getting our grips on why is it that we're here? What did it take to reach the level of planetary disruption and climatic disruption that we call climate change or climate emergency? But also dipping into history and approaching biocultural memory, which is not my term, but it's a phrase used by two great academics, Narciso Barrera Balsols and Victor Toledo from Mexico. It's this appreciation that human communities have been nourishing, protecting, stewarding, safeguarding their ecologies for millennia. That the memory of humanity in relationship with our ecologies is not a simple story of just destruction, which is often what the climate story is, right? It's humanity has caused the climate crisis is the mainstream story, when we know that that's very clearly not the case. It's an incredibly simplistic story, which what it does is it erases the memory of protection, the memory of nourishing. I'll give one concrete example, but people speak about the phenomenon in the Amazon of terra preta, which is black earth. This idea that the Amazon is also is biodiverse to this incredible extent because of the interference and the intervention of human communities over millennia who helped make it more biodiverse. It's no mistake that when you look at a map of the world, imagine in your mind what are the most biodiverse regions of the world. Take another map and think what are the most linguistically and culturally diverse parts of the world. The maps overlap. Human diversity nourishes biological diversity. So I think tapping into the story of memory to me is crucial because it anchors us. It helps us resist a lot of nonsense around the climate crisis. It gives us a bit of a grounding. And it invites us to think about the future in a much more creative way because it sees our future as a conversation between our past and between our possibility, rather than, I think, the techno-utopian or solutionist ideas that are proposed, which is like, we need to start from scratch. Humanity is in need of just innovation, when in fact, human history is one of constant interaction and learning with other beings around us on what it's like to be. So I think that's my starting point, I guess, is just an invitation for us to be more memorious, more willing to look back before rushing forward. But how do you see it? I mean, your work has always grappled with the past as almost, I think, as moral obligation. But I'm curious to know also how you understand this, at least in the context of the climate crisis too.
Yeah. Okay, I'll give a bit of background, but before getting there, one thought that came to my mind while you were talking is the pretty trendy thing these days of just thinking that all we need to do is to just plant X number of trees, and it feels like it almost doesn't matter, or I mean, we know why, but a lot of the studies that have really come out studying the efficiency of that system, of that framework, many of those trees don't survive because they're not planted in the right way, or they're kind of planted very quickly, or they're planted just for the photo shoots, as we know. And it's not a mathematical thing. It's not like we destroyed 10 trees in Portugal, therefore if we plant 10 trees in, I don't know, Peru, then we've kind of canceled them, like level the playing field. That's just not how nature works. That's not how most things work.
Yeah.
But it fits within, like I think I described in a previous conversation, that there is an act of violence there, because we're trying to force the world that we depend on, the living system that we depend, and I'm saying we in quotation, what is kind of being done at a kind of the hegemonic level of things, if we want to put it that way, the powers at be, whatever, is that we're trying to force the world to fit a human model, and the world just doesn't work that way. And at some point there has to be a reckoning, or if we don't do that, obviously the fear is that there is something that breaks, and what breaks, that can be anything from the offshoots, or getting to a point where we've unleashed something that can't be controlled anymore, whatever. All of those legitimate fears that we have, at least partly or to some significant extent, come from this refusal, I would say, or inability in some cases. It's not like I'm not trying to remember. I'm being as general as I can in order not to make it turn this into like an individualistic thing that we should do or listeners should do, whatever. But just in the sense of what seems to be the norm these days, it really feels that way. Now, in sense, yeah, I've been doing this research for a few years now on memory in Lebanon, especially. And after some time, long story short, I got into this a few times on the podcast, but I understood that my family, and then I started first like myself first only, as in me, my relatives maybe, and then I started kind of growing and kind of expanding that analysis, if you want, of just the role of memory and the role of stories and the link between memory and imagination. There's this great term, I've mentioned it a few times, like the mnemonic imagination. And it says essentially that it's not that there is a hierarchy between imagination and memory. Those are linguistic categories, and the two of them are intimately linked. You can't have memory without imagination. You can't have imagination without memory. Imagination is always rooted in something, your experience, someone else's experience, and that ultimately has something to do with memories. And your memory is not the same. If you're remembering an event, the most studied one is kind of like 9/11, and people who were there, people who weren't there. And studies that have kind of come out is that their memories of that same event actually changes over time. Like if you remembered it for the 5th time, it's not the same as for the 100th time, right? And it's not that you forget necessarily. It's more that other things happen in the process. And so that sort of understanding, if you want, led me to almost naturally, if that's the correct term, I'm not sure, to seek, okay, well, this is how we're affected by quote unquote the past. What's the other side of it? Like what's the future? What does futurism look like? And the thing that I think really clicked one day was studying hauntology, which we can get into, and studying these alternative futurisms, alternative futures, futurities would be another term in some context, of the what ifs of history, i.e. not taking history for granted. And you can sort of start this on a not superficial level, but maybe easier level by telling yourself, what if this big historical figure had died at this point, or maybe had never existed, or, the whole thing of what if someone had killed baby Hitler, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And of course, you do this as kind of training sort of a muscle, a creative muscle maybe, but won't necessarily give you any answers, because by default, you will never, like by definition, you will never know. But you can sort of start that way maybe, and in that way you're linking directly the past, or what if that thing in the past hadn't happened or had happened differently or whatever, and then you're thinking of, well, the future would have looked differently because the present would have looked differently, and so everything would have changed. And in our imagination, it's, I think, easier these days because a lot of science fiction movies and whatnot fall under that premise, like the alternative timelines, these kinds of things, like, and the idea of the multiple universes as well, as in the sense that you may have multiple actions, many versions of yourselves in the past, all of these things. It helps at least contextualize the complexity of our current world and breaks that, I think, very ultimately nationalist, reactionary, isolationist, and other isms tendency, which is sometimes I call it as the default fear-based framework, in the sense that when you feel overwhelmed by the world, it's easier to kind of fall back on your own certainties. And the risk, obviously, is that today we're seeing the world becoming interlinked in ways at a pace that has never really happened before.
Yeah.
Like there's no comparison between the pre-internet age and what we're currently experiencing. And as it happens, there is a link there, but it's not a direct correlation. We're also living in a time of climate like urgency, crisis, and potential catastrophe, and already existing catastrophe to some extent as well. And those two can kind of clash with one another, right? We can think of the links that quote unquote populists on the right make between migration and the climate crisis. And this kind of falls unfortunately, very neatly into pretty mainstream views of conservation, of ecology, of humans equal problem. And so we need to reduce humans. Obviously, if you scale that up, you reach pretty dark and dangerous conclusions. But the conclusions are usually not explicitly mentioned, but the starting points are often that way. And what gets erased is exactly what you mentioned, the example of the Amazon, other examples where humans actually are in the problem. And I admit, I used to think this way. I think I was filled with a anger towards humans in general. Just a anxiety and angst at what we are doing. And it's normal to feel like, well, we're doing so much and there's so many of us, we just need to reduce. Like we need to stop, slow down, reduce, just stop. Something needs to stop. And it's normal to think that way, I think, as a normal reaction, I should say. But that's what it is. It's a reaction. It doesn't actually say anything. It certainly doesn't move you forward. You're acting like by subtractions, right? You just want to reduce and reduce and reduce in order to have fewer things to think about at the end of the day. And that is obviously not the way to go.
There's so much there, but I think there's it links to the fear-based framework that you talk about, but also this idea that you raise really well, this need to fit things into a model because of fear, because of, I guess, the fear of abandoning a particular dominant paradigm. And to me, the climate crisis, I mean, and you can put many other different crises or historical moments in that bracket, right? But the climate crisis, if it doesn't really upend and challenge some of your base worldviews, then I don't think you're really approaching it with the complexity and dignity that it deserves. I think what often people want to do, and the example of like plant X of trees, is people want to boil it down to like, give me the 2-3 solutions, or what are the 2-3 things you can do at home to solve this? And that's the thing, the climate crisis is, if we want to develop an ecological paradigm, I mean, the basis of ecology is that not only is the world more complex than you think, it's more complex than you can think. So you immediately start to have to get humble and realize exactly that a tree is not a tree in different locations, that building a different energy system that's renewable is not just replicating a fossil fuel system. It means building other kinds of relationships. It means realizing, for example, that if we're serious about the impacts of climate change, the impacts of climate change don't depend just on the severity of the weather. They depend on the severity of the social injustice that the weather meets on the ground. So we have to be transforming so many different things, not just the things that drive climate change. And that means that we have to become fluent in climatology, but also in housing, in inequality, in poverty. Like, we have to be able to be humble and interested in so many different things and look at this from multiple perspectives. And that is deeply unsettling to the status quo. And it's deeply challenging to a mindset of separation or a mindset of control, of simplification. But what I'm really interested, Joey, what you mentioned, like this idea that our imagination is rooted in memory. And that, in a way, trapped sometimes by our memory of our experiences, especially experiences of deep, chronic historical trauma. And I'm interested, like your approach towards solar punk, for example, as a stream of futurism. I'm really curious also recently about the idea of play, like how we can get people to look beyond the strictures of what they might have experienced. And this is on an individual level and on a societal level, it expands. But play to me is so crucial as a kind of almost like an organizing principle of how we work and what we need for society. And we know that play is rooted in a healthy imagination, a capacity to feel safe in trying and experimenting and doing things differently, which is obviously compounded or really, really constrained by trauma or by particular experiences. But I'm curious, how has solar punk come into your life? And I'm also curious, I think for a lot of folks, one big paradox that we struggle with is the the distinction between us as our individual lives and our collective lives. And often, I think we can talk about these great futuristic ideas, and they feel very often, sometimes for a lot of folks, aloof and like another possible world. But I'm curious also, if it's not too intimate, like how has solar punk also changed maybe your life, if it has, on a world of the scale of you and your body, if that makes sense.
Solarpunk, I came across it kind of by happenstance on this podcast. I think the first time I had actually heard about it was Emmy Bevansy. And as I said, in the end, I asked folks to recommend stuff, like recommend books. And Emmy had said, I think at some point, like anything Afrofuturist or solarpunk is something that they are interested in. I forgot the exact quote that they mentioned, but something along the lines of, because I'm impressed or I'm humbled by people who still imagine positive futures, given the reality of our world. And this was like 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, in the beginning of the podcast, I think. So the pandemic was relatively new. It was definitely at a moment of what felt like a sort of a reckoning, or could have been sort of a reckoning. But for me, 2020 was like the pandemic, but the explosion in Beirut. Those are the two things that 2020 for me was. And also my going into, at the time, I didn't quite understand it that way, but eventually I would, like my going into exile. Because I left in 2019, end of 2019, to come here in Switzerland, and it felt kind of wild, really. I arrived here early 2020, actually, and I just have this memory, and it's connected to solarpunk, but I'll try and explain myself. Like on New Year's 2019, 2020, I was with some friends in the mountains in Lebanon, and I remember very well, I was still struggling with technology addiction back then, so I was on Twitter at some point. And it mentioned that it was one of those breaking news of like suspicious cases of pneumonia, whatever it was called, identified in Wuhan or something along those lines. And I just remembered me and a couple of friends who also, I did my undergrad in environmental health, which included epidemiology. We just looked at each other and said, this looks really bad. And we almost chuckled at the idea, like, this just looks really bad. And, fast forward barely 8 months after that, and a pandemic obviously was ravaging, spreading out throughout the world, and which affected Lebanon as it did everywhere, but affected specifically Lebanon with an economic crisis that was already there and that just made it worse. And to kind of add the cherry on top of the cake, the explosion happens on the 4th of August of 2020. And my PhD at the same time was already about memory. The topic is called, I think, Hauntings and Temporalities in Post-War Lebanese Cinema. And it's about not just the past, but it's past heavy. It's a lot about the impact of the past, the legacy of the past, what is the past? Like, are we even beyond the past? i.e., is the present something completely separate from the past? And that again, through the haunting framework, a couple of the episodes that would have been released before this one, we get into it a bit more. And so it kind of felt in some sense like the explosion forced me to stop, because that's what it was. It's in a very brutal and violent way. It stopped time. It fell and there is this imagery of the clock at 6:07 p.m. Because that's when the explosion happened, and a lot of the clocks obviously were destroyed at that time. So it's kind of like time was frozen, and that event in itself felt very haunting. Because I was studying ghosts and hauntings and phantoms and whatnot, and suddenly you have all of those images that I've been studying in the movies that were produced in the 90s, early 2000s, and suddenly you have this just thing that happened in real time, right? And it's by necessity that I was looking for alternatives to that. It felt like the past became overwhelming, trapped us. We were unable to get out of it. We had a moment at the end of 2019 with the uprising in Lebanon to kind of open up that world. And then with the explosion, what happened, Lara Bitar, who's a Lebanese journalist, she described it as evaporated euphoria. And I was kind of curious as to where did it evaporate to, right? Like literally, where is it? It's something that evaporates, it goes somewhere. It doesn't disappear into the ether. When you smoke, the smoke goes somewhere. You don't see it anymore, but it's been dispersed in the air, right? And so I wanted to think of like, okay, well, where is that euphoria now? And in my view, and obviously the academics and the others that I've been studying, it's there somewhere. It's there as a haunting quality. It might have a haunting quality. It becomes a what if. it becomes something that we end up contrasting, or, oh, we could have been living this way had we succeeded, right? Like we could say these things. And that in and of itself, these thoughts, which can be reproduced at a kind of a cultural and social level, end up affecting how individually we relate to the present. And so that's kind of the link between those two. And solar punk for me is just one of those ways. And I think it's one of the best ways because it intersects the climate crisis. It kind of brings it in conversation with the quote unquote politics, i.e. like to really try and have a practical, arguing that we need to be very practical about the climate crisis while at the same time be very visionary and utopian about it. Like those two have to coexist at the same time, because as we know, we're kind of plagued with the poverty of the imagination in many ways when it comes to what we should do, how we should imagine our futures and whatnot. And in order to do that, we need to also not just lose ourselves in that utopian futurism, but bring it back to our current moment and work to affect that current moment using those visions as kind of like almost like you're building a number of horizons to go towards. And maybe you never get there, but you need something to go towards, essentially.
That's super, super beautiful. It reminds me of that just final point that you've made reminds me of this great anecdote where the legendary Uruguayan author Eduardo Galeano was on a panel with an Argentine film director called Fernando Wirri, and a student in the audience asked them, "What's the purpose of utopia?" And Galeano says, "Look, that's too complicated a question of me." And so Fernando Wirri, this filmmaker, sits and is like, "Give me a minute." And then Fernando, after a minute, replies, "Look, it's like, look, I think utopia is like the horizon. You walk 2 steps towards it, the horizon moves 2 steps back. You walk 3 steps towards it, the horizon moves 3 steps back. Yeah. And so what's the point of that then? Well, it's exactly that. So you keep on walking." And I think this, I'm still sitting with this metaphor of evaporated euphoria. And I'm also just sitting with the challenge. I mean, in so many contexts, what does it look like to recrystallize, to bring that euphoria back? How do you animate people? There's the Lebanese context. I mean, we straddle so many different contexts between us, and then there's the planetary context. Mm-hmm. But for so many folks, going back to where we started, which is in a rhythm of relentlessness, it's hard to dream or hard to imagine if you're at a pace of just reaction all the time. Let alone if you're just in the pace of reaction all the time, if your political horizons promise little beyond, deep dystopia, it's very, very difficult for you to ground yourself in possibility. Especially also if your material circumstances mean that every day is a struggle, constant struggle. So yeah, I'm just sitting with, at least I'm curious on what do you see as potential horizons for people to find ways of bringing hope down. To me, there's so many. I think there's the importance of talking about healing, the importance of talking about our bodies also as spaces of struggle and building. The importance of finding play and joy and moments of euphoria, as difficult as it might be in our own lives, and using those as possibilities of emotional contagion as well, of getting people animated about political possibility. But then also, there's some serious work to be done in territories all around the world about recovering what it's like to have flourishing territories. And what I'm also sitting with, and I'm going back to our journey to Coimbra as well, so many of the landscapes around the world that have also been seen evaporated memory, where the ways of relating to a territory, the diversity of a territory, the ways in which people could exist in a landscape with an impact that was co-nourishing. So much of that has been lost, and especially in some of the sites of the global north of intense prosperity as well. That's been hand in hand with just full-on violent assault and clearance of all ecologies, to the extent where you almost have nothing left, right? So I'm sitting with just where do you see as real possibilities for people to go in that process almost of unevaporating that euphoria, if I can use the metaphor.
So obviously, part of it, like just thinking of Coimbra, we learned about the eucalyptus trees while we were there and how they kind of became this monoculture. And I think one of the folks who was with us, one of the academics, called them like they're not forests, they're tree plantations, right? And those kinds of it kind of let me put it this way. It kind of, when I mentioned before, like a lot of the solutions that are sort of being proposed these days is that we just need to plant stuff. We just need to have X amount of trees, and it's basically almost doesn't matter basically, or it really doesn't matter in that discourse which trees we're actually planting. But it matters which tree we're planting, because there are trees in a different ecosystem, and trees function differently. Obviously, trees are incredibly complex in ways that we barely understand as humans. And I found it very interesting that I think, if I'm not wrong, if I just think that Coimbra example just as kind of a mnemonic aid for me to try and answer this, I think most folks who, maybe not folks who are from there or from around there, maybe they know. But I think I would think that most folks in Portugal don't know the history of the tree plantations, for example, or don't know what Portugal looked like, I don't know, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, and whatever. And again, this isn't to say that that would be enough, because we can then fall into a trap of, oh, we just need to go back to the good old days or whatever. And that has a lot of very dark resonances when it comes to nationalism and that sort of thing, as we know. And that's not the point, really. The point is to just acknowledge, or to kind of sit with, recognize that we live in a particular moment of history and nothing is written in stone, i.e. that in the same way as something was changed for the worse, other things would change for the better. We gave the example of the Amazon. That's an example of something clearly that was changed for the better. And better we can obviously debate philosophically what is better and what is worse, but just better in the sense of things have become more diverse, have quite literally, there is a increase in diversity, and the richness of a place increases, if we can use that. And we know that the model that is, so if you consider that to be a model, let's say, the other model, which is quote unquote ours, the one that we live in, most places in the global north, and the significant percentage of the global south as well these days, through globalization and neoliberalism and all of that. One of those two models, and here again I'm simplifying just for the mnemonic aid, one of those two models has had some good results, their model, quote unquote, and our model clearly is having bad results. So if we were in a supposedly rationalist culture, one that values bringing in as much data as possible and changing our habits to fit that data, that's supposed to be one of the basic principles of rationality and scientific principle in many ways. If that was the case, we clearly wouldn't be where we are today, because we have known where this is going for some time now, but all we've done really is not just not do much about it, but actually accelerate the pace of destruction. We know that since the COPs started, the what does COP actually stand for?
Conference of Parties.
Yes. Since they started, investments towards fossil fuels actually went up. And so that is clearly irrational, to use that term, and yet it is quoted in quote unquote realistic, or being realistic, right? And so what does that mean? And again, did a number of episodes that will come out before this one, like talking about capitalist realism, Mark Fisher, that sort of thing. But what does it mean to be realistic? And that's what I'm trying to challenge. And you can do that through stories, through conversations, through pointing out very, very practically. People need often, I found, and I certainly am this way as well. It's one thing to tell someone, oh, we need to do this, and this would be nicer, wouldn't it? Wouldn't it be nice if we lived in a commune, utopic commune and whatnot? Oh, that would be nice, like the Shire. And, most folks don't disagree with that necessarily. They can see how this feels nice, and this, oh, well, I won't have to worry about rent. Everyone has healthcare. We can take care of one another. That doesn't seem like a bad thing. Most folks would have no issues agreeing that this feels better than the current world we live in. But it feels somehow unrealistic. And I'm not saying a communist state is how we should all live, but in the sense that those alternative visions of what life can be like feel unrealistic. And my contention is that the realism is an ism, it's a belief. And it's a social construct. And as it can be constructed, it can be deconstructed. And so all of those things, from haunting to solar punk to understanding our bioculture and memory, for me, those are ways of grounding myself in reality, actually being quote unquote more realistic, and taking it seriously. You mentioned play before, right? And play has this characteristic of being relegated to the unserious, right? Like, okay, it's nice to have a hobby, but you can't live out of it. That's not realistic unless you're very lucky and you're good at that hobby, let's say. But for most folks, it's like, well, I'm doing this hobby, and I think many folks would have realized by at some point that when they're doing this hobby is when they're actually very happy, or at least they're happier compared to, let's say, going to work. Generalization here, but like let's say this is true just entertain me. I think that in and of itself speaks a lot. This relegation, this division between the serious and the unserious, and here I'm simplifying a bit, has a lot to do with how things are institutionalized even at a young age. I've been getting, and I'm gonna hopefully do an episode soon on that, the concept of youth autonomy, unlearning, unschooling, that sort of thing, or alternative schoolings, maybe we might call it, and how like from a very, very young age we are already standardizing certain norms that then become internalized and then become or feel natural, realistic, all of these buzzwords in quotation, of course. But if we're kind of this alien species looking down at the human species, and when we haven't internalized the things that the humans who grew up in that system have internalized, there's no reason why those aliens would conclude that this is the best way of doing things.
Yeah.
Because the assumptions would not be the same, presumably. So, I see how you can play with these things and play pun on that, but you can play with these different concepts or different ideas. And that's why for me, like I genuinely argue that when I watch something like Star Trek, I do so with the same seriousness, and I'm putting seriousness in quotation, but same seriousness generally as I do when I'm reading an IPCC report. Like I'm not lying when I say that. It's really the attitude that I adopt, and it doesn't mean like it. How I put it this way? It doesn't mean that the IPCC is less important than Star Trek. I don't care about these kind of comparisons. But the IPCC and the IPCC authors themselves, including Julia Steinberger, who I've had on this podcast a number of times and I've interacted with and I've been on panels with, the climate scientists themselves have been basically saying that we need something beyond just science in order to change things. That's why they are getting arrested now. They are going on hunger strike. Here in Switzerland, we had one case. Guillermo is his name. And, we wouldn't be needing climate scientists going on strike, going on hunger strike, stopping highways and whatnot, if we were living in a quote-unquote realistic society. Our society is extremely unrealistic, or our political system, let's put it that way, is downright suicidal at this point, if we can use that term.
Yeah.
And so for me, this realization, and at some point, once you then internalize that, it's almost like a matrix thing. Like it stops working. It's just, it's not that I don't also have to live by those rules and regulations. I need a salary. I need to follow a career. I need to do this X and Y and Z in order to survive. I still live within capitalism. But it's almost like now I understand what kind of a prison that is, how restrictive that is. And that is the main difference. And I think there is an argument, there's something to be said that through that realization, through that understanding, it can feel liberatory. So it doesn't mean that I don't deal with, you and I are in this chat group on eco-anxiety and climate anxiety. So I have it. I have this. I have grief. I have depression. I'm on antidepressants. Like I go through difficulties as well. It's by no means am I making the argument that if you open your mind, you will just free yourself or whatever. No, you're still confined by a number of very restrictive and frankly authoritarian practices, violent practices, and the systems of capitalism, basically, and patriarchy and all of these things. But in order to even hope that we can get beyond them, we need to be doing the work of picturing these alternatives, quite literally picturing them in our minds. So yeah, that was a bit of a long response, but that's sort of how I play with it, how I kind of becoming comfortable with open-ended questions and kind of blurry alternatives and blurry visions, i.e. they're not very concrete yet, they don't necessarily make sense, but it doesn't mean that I'm going to cast them away. I'm going to just leave them there somehow, pin that, and maybe you get back to it once you have more data, so to speak.
Yeah. I think, there's so much to sit with from what you've said. I think what you're hinting at as well is also just reflecting on the question of liberation. What does it mean to, at this moment, what does liberation look like? And that's a question that's far beyond me or anything I know or my experience. But I think from people I admire, from elders, it's opening our horizons. It's stretching ourselves towards, this Gilmour idea of rehearsing freedom, rehearsals of freedom, finding ways in our daily lives and in our communal lives to stretch people, to get people to shake a little bit some of the systems that we live in. And I love the way you bring it back to like what you were talking about in terms of the schooling system and the way in which we're schooled for obedience and also for conformity. One thing that I'm quite interested in, a question that I've sat with for many years, is having been involved in many movements and worked for many organizations, is how very quickly particular logics just become dominant within organizations and ways of working, highly bureaucratized, highly planned, highly quote unquote rational or scientificist ways of thinking and being and moving. And I find it astounding how we keep on replicating often the things that we're trying to really, really dismantle, but just how overpowering often they are. And I think partly, there's so many reasons for it. I don't know enough either, but I think the undervaluing of play, the undervaluing of surprise and spontaneity and awe and spirituality and all these other quite challenging logics, and not even logics, but like just ways of being in the world. I think it's so important that we begin to cultivate them. And I think a culture of urgency asks you immediately to be like, what's the one thing I can do? What's the two things I can do? What do I leave this with? I need something to do. Exactly. It's like, wait, maybe some of the most important things to leave with is actually that unnerving, that like sense, as you said, of like blurring of the vision. And I think that's what I'm increasingly pulled towards, is also, from an ecological perspective at least, getting people to become more sensitive to other beings in the world and how they move in the world. And what can we learn from the way that trees organize? What can we learn from the way in which, fungal networks move and mobilize? What are the things that we have to be humbled by and learn about organization and transformation in the world? And as soon as I think you dip into that space of listening, things become you become challenged very quickly, and things are quite unclear, and the possibilities of what you can do as a human become more nebulous. But I think that's a very fertile process, and one that can help people to find new spaces to anchor their lives. And also, at least if, often what trauma does is just overpowers the imagination. It just destroys your capacity to imagine yourself as anything different. And we need that, to invest in our imagination, to have a healthy sense of aliveness and play, I think is indispensable for any radical political vision.
Exactly. This is going to sound funny at first, but I've been really curious, and it's kind of become this experiment that I'm doing. I would watch a TV series, right, on Netflix or whatever. And because now I'm sort of tuned to that, or like kind of looking for these patterns, I think I've kind of realized that in all of, or at least the series that I'm thinking of, I'm talking about popular ones that many people would have watched, like Friends, Seinfeld, I don't know, The Office, whatever, Community, or like those are like kind of light-hearted comedy stuff. But other stuff, Gilmour Girls, The Sandman, almost anything really that I'm watching these days, or I've watched. The thing that kind of brings people together, even in those stories that are not utopian, right? Like, I don't know, if I think of The Office, there's nothing utopian about it. It actually mocks, in many ways, the world we live in. But the nice things about that, kind of those bonds that they're creating, is when they don't take what they do very seriously. I.e., like, in some sense, there's a couple of them, we don't even know what they're doing in that office. Like, they don't have a definite job position. The job positions change a lot. They don't seem to actually like it, and the only person who likes it is kind of the guy who's seen as the, like, Dwight. He's the comic relief in some sense, and he takes it a bit too seriously. And there's even jokes within the series that, well, actually his ancestors were Nazis, and this is why he's so into like order and whatnot. So they play around with all of this, but just that and other examples. I can give so many examples, like Gilmour Girls. And for me, because me and my wife, we were really into it at some point. What's kind of beautiful about it, I mean, it's problematic in many ways, as most things are. But what's kind of beautiful about that world is that Stars Hollow, which is that town in Connecticut or something in the U.S., there is a town hall or town meeting. They have this town meeting every at regular times, and they always complain about it, but they always go to it. They always complain how pointless it is and how the guy, the main mayor or whatever, he's kind of a douche. But they like the ritual of always going there. And again, it's there are no brands there. There's no McDonald's, there's no whatever. It's kind of a community, and it's still capitalistic, right? Like there's still a hotel, there's an inn, there's a cafe and whatnot. But those are like the placeholders because this is to be realistic, quote unquote, you have to create a setting that most people who already live in this world can identify as like, oh, well, I can see this. But then you make it actually nicer than most places that most people these days are living in by having a community. And Community, the TV series, again, same thing, is that the thing that they're actually doing in that community school doesn't actually matter as much as the fact that when they are together, the things that they're building. And we see this time and time again, that in these TV series, that in order for them to have an audience, they have to appeal to us. And of course, you can do this well and you can do this badly, and it can be a shitty thing that appeals to us for because we can't get our attention away from it because it's so bad. But it can also be that it makes you feel some kind of bond with the people who are in that TV series, right? Like that emotional connection that people have when they watch movies and series and read books and whatnot. And the thing that's in it is often nuggets or like a potential there that is actually liberatory.
Yeah.
And another example I think of is that I'm spacing out, but I think in Friends at some point, one of them is unable to pay rent, so he just lives with the person who is able to pay rent or something like that. It becomes a joke that, I think it's Joey basically, he can't pay rent because he's an actor and whatever, so Chandler is the one who's paying rent. And that's not a capitalist way of doing things.
Yeah.
They just practice some form of mutual aid there without actually thinking about it or acknowledging it for what it is. It's just, but this is what friendship is about. And those basic bonds that we have, friendship, family, when family is not toxic, love, or, other relationships that we may have, they are often damaged when we introduce these hyper authoritarian, hierarchical, capitalistic way of doing things. They actually damage them. You're my friend, don't worry about that, I'll pick the tab, maybe you pay for it next time. It doesn't become a purely mathematical thing, right?
Yeah.
But this purely mathematical thing is how the economy is structured. And so we have this huge tension between the things that we think of as nice, the family, and I'm putting the family in quotation because obviously family can be very toxic and problematic as well. But the healthy types, let's say chosen families and families that are not toxic, friendships, lovers, relationships, whatnot, that sort of thing. The things that we know, like as human beings, we know we can't live without. That's why the worst kind of punishments at the time was banishment, right? Being banished from a certain town, or solitary confinement being one of the worst types of torture today. Anyway, I'm rambling too much, but all of this to say, like we already, to some extent, we all already know that we need community.
Yeah.
We feel it, but there's a dissociation. There's I think a violent break between the thing that we know we need and being realistic, quote unquote. And if being realistic harms us, there's something wrong with that realism. It's not actually realistic, essentially.
Yeah. Wow, what a beautiful reflection. And I think great to also use these examples of TV shows where I hadn't thought about it that much, but yeah, like what we're drawn to is the community and the play. When you look at something like The Office, the reason that we love it is because I think often there's this dream that I wish I could live in this world, in my world of drudgery.
Exactly.
And I think on the last reflection...
Even what's kind of brilliant about it is that it's an office.
Yeah.
Like it's so... no one wants to live in an office. It seems boring, but it kind of becomes fun, and they kind of get to know each other, and it kind of feels that when they go home, they're not going home. It's when they go to the office that they're going home.
Yeah.
And the function of that office, it kind of becomes irrelevant and actually becomes harmful, i.e. the reason why it's an office, the fact that it is an office and it is like one branch of that paper company, Dunya Macmillen or whatever, interferes in their community building, in their friendship building, and whatnot, because they don't own the building until at some point, that sort of thing. So anyway, just wanted to even offices, even something as non-community, as non-familial, non-friendship based things, we still need that there in order to make them enjoyable. Because otherwise, if you were filming, a TV series about an office that actually functions like an office, who the fuck would want to watch that? it becomes so depressing, and like most people think that's what my office looks like. I don't want to watch that.
Yeah.
I need an escapism.
Yeah.
And so we imagine a better office.
Which, yeah, that's really interesting, almost on the utopian possibilities of, and I'm thinking also of Superstore as well, as another, I don't know if you've seen
Yes.
it, but also as a very, kind of very similar logic. What I'm struck with as well is like, well, first, like those almost TV series and films can be, like, they can be deeply radicalizing if you approach them in the right way. But I'm also sitting with, I went to a workshop on play recently, which I had no idea about in Barcelona. And one of the things that happened was, in order to make it work, there was a rule that was given before we arrived. It was a full day of like basically meeting people that you've never met in your life before, and to build a spirit of play. And I was like, I mean, I'm not the kind of person that usually does this, so I just did it to take a risk. But one of the first things they did was say, okay, the only rule is you can't speak. You're not allowed to speak for the whole day. You're going to be with other people. You're going to be playing. Played all sorts of games, but without speaking. And it was fantastic because like we spent 12 hours with each other, and you realize it made me realize many things. But one of them was just how many assumptions we make from speech about so many things, about education, about class, about just so many different just prejudices that appear just on how people speak, and how healing it is to almost remove or place that limit. And it got me thinking a lot about the importance of limits as an invitation to play. That unless we set limits, unless we make, like, physically make limits possible, then it's very, very difficult to make anything happen, especially things that are counter-hegemonic, especially things that we want to be different. And there's so many practices, I think, of in my life where I try and set limits and set boundaries. I think this is almost like a micro metaphor on a larger scale of the things that we need as well in terms of dealing with the ecological crisis. We know that it's a crisis of an incapability to set limits, an attempt to erase all limits of all kinds on the economy, on human productivity, on human life. But it sits with me on the importance almost of like why it's deeply important to bring limits in, and with that comes sanctity, because sanctity is a great way of talking about limits, and that can invite us towards playing. And like until we say this stops here, we can do this, but we stop this work effort right here, then it's impossible to start to build the spaces where we can dream and to work, unless we create limits in time or limits in behavior. Then I think we end up in a situation where these experiences of play and liberation become escapist experiences that we dip into rather than practices. That makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. I just thought of a friend of mine called Yumna. Shout out! I'll send this to her. But she I think her part-time or full-time job, I'm not sure, but she's a clown. She actually does clowning.
Amazing.
And I found that like it challenged my own assumption. I have another friend, May, who also did that at some point. But it challenged my assumption of taking the ridiculous, quote unquote, as just ridiculous, right? I.e. as something to be cast aside, right? Oh, this is ridiculous, or this is childish, or whatever. And what the example you just gave it's very interesting, because if I understood correctly, because when we're in a certain situation, if we're told we can't talk, right, then it's kind of ridiculous, right? Like there's something about it that's clownish, quote unquote, i.e. like it's a playful, right? Like you're in a situation where, I don't know, I'm imagining it, like you're in a room with like 10 people or 20 people or whatever, and you cannot talk, but you have to play. And so I assume a lot of in the beginning is like, well, we're kind of just laughing at each other, how ridiculous all of this is. And just that alone ends up being a kind of a way of breaking the ice, right? Like the assumptions that we would have, or maybe like, I'm not a sociable person, or I can't communicate that easily, that sort of thing, becomes less important in many ways, because, well, we're not talking anyway. We don't have to perform in a certain way. My accent doesn't have to show, maybe my social class doesn't have to show, even my gender maybe doesn't have to show, since I'm not talking, all of these things. And it emphasizes, doesn't it, like how certain senses are primal or are treated as primal. Vision would be an obvious big one. In our in society in general, and in the worlds that we live, I think. And that's very interesting, because part of what, let's say, solar punk can do, if done well, I think, in the good stories that I've read some stories that were not that engaging, but those that I've read that were, is what do we mean when we say like putting a different imaginary or creating a different imaginary? It's not just like literally doing the world building, which is very fun, and I encourage everyone to play with that as well. But being able, like the good stories that really capture us, and I can think of, for example, The Lord of the Rings, because I was really into it growing up, or even Harry Potter, pre J.K. Rowling becoming what she is now. This strength of those stories is that you genuinely felt that you were in that world. Like I grew up roughly around the same time. We had almost the same age as the Harry Potter characters, more or less, give or take a year or so. And so, 12th year, I was 12, and Hogwarts, they're 12 and whatever. And there was a very intimate bond being created, one obviously, between me and these fictional characters, right? And this was possible despite me later, when I grew up and became older and wiser and whatever, understood to be some of the problematic element of those stories, Lord of the Rings as well, for that matter. But it's not that you shouldn't know these things. You can still know these things and still be enchanted by the intricacies of world building. And I guess with all of kind of a through line in what we've been talking about is most people, as I think I can make that claim. Of course, I haven't met most people, but I think I can make that claim that most people already understand, like intimately, why something like mutual aid is a good thing. And people do this naturally. A community comes together when there is a catastrophe. It's actually not how a lot of the movies often portray things, because that's actually a reflection of what's called elite panic, which is an academic term. People can look it up. I should do something on elite panic one day. But elite panic actually runs the world in many ways. Those assumptions, those fears about overpopulation and people coming here and all of that stuff comes from that worldview, not from quote unquote being realistic. It's actually very unrealistic, and it's very violent. And so me realizing, I think at some point, that there is actually a very basic human thing that when we're kids, often, here I'm generalizing because it depends on people's childhoods, they're not all the same, but in my case, I sort of knew this somehow. Like it felt that it's a good thing to be good. It's a good thing to not have greed and poverty and violence and, very vague terms like that. But as the kid, like seeing it through those eyes. And at some point, I had to cast all of that aside in order to become, quote unquote, more realistic. I can't do this or that in life because you need to be realistic. You need to do this. You have to do a career. You have to go through certain steps. You have to build a CV. And we're actually, the school in many ways, as it's usually conceptualized, of course there are different types of schooling, some better than others, but usually I went to like a lycée system, so kind of a French system, but in Lebanon. It's very, it prioritizes memory over imagination, repetition over experience, over experimentation. Grades, obviously, you either are above 10 over 20 or below 10 over 20, and that actually defines you quite literally. Everyone knows what I'm talking about. But these forms of I think to some extent we can describe them as structural violence, are embedded from a very early age, and not just from a very early age, but then at some point become reified and reiterated and replicated in adulthood and until we die, essentially. And it's kind of, I think, ironic. And again, it goes back to the argument that to some extent we all understand this, that for many of us think these days the social contract, as it's usually defined, is that you work for a certain number of years, you pay your taxes for a certain number of years, and then you go on la retraite, you retire, right? And it's like, well, I can't enjoy some hobbies now, so I'll do so when I'm 65 and above, right? It's like almost like when I'm at a certain age, then I can really enjoy my life. And that's a fundamental flaw in how societies function, that you need to wait 6+ decades, depending on when you live, in some cases 7 decades, in order to enjoy your life, assuming, of course, you even manage to go through the 3-4 decades of work, quote-unquote normal work, paying taxes, a career, all of that stuff. Then maybe you can explore your love of Japanese or how you like knitting or, whatever. Only then, or now you can do it, but as a hobby, like on the side, not as your main thing.
Yeah.
Unless you find a way to turn it into something profitable, into a business. And so we're stuck in those frameworks. We know what we enjoy. Like, it's not rocket science. We know what things, we know what humans love. We know that, again, the community thing, the play. We know that these things are nice and fun, and we think of them as nice and fun, but we kind of discard them, or we make some kind of separation between what is fun and what is realistic. Again, I'm using that term a lot.
Yeah. I come back to hearing you. I come back to that's. I think it's a great reflection that you say, that I've also heard David Graeber say, this term kind of baseline communism. This idea that like daily life cannot function without baseline communism, and also which just from basic reproductive labor that's undervalued, unvalued.
Exactly.
Like it cannot function under capitalist logic. It's just no way that you can't optimize care. You can't care more quickly for someone. Like these things just they destroy the capitalist logic, and so you have to ignore them or devalue them or invisibilize them.
Exactly.
But I think alerting people and showing them that not only there's other ways of doing things, but we do them already. We do them instinctively because that's part of like what we need. That love, the ethics of love can't work in conjunction with the ethics of domination, of true healthy love. I mean, there's many types of love. But I think it's all these places are almost threads that we can start to pull on and get people to think in ways that I consider more ecological, and then to start campaigning in also ways that people can find more resonant with their daily kind of spiritual experience of the world. I think one mistake that the climate movement has made is to not speak poetically in terms of people's own lives, right? I think many of the things that we have to fight for from considerations in terms of, living in a more carbon-constrained, resource-constrained world, one thing that I think is a very powerful frame of organizing is talking about time poverty, that we have the capacity to extend people to have more time in their lives, high quality time for them to do things that they find meaningful, that liberation of time, that some of the things that bring people most joy are the least resource intensive things. Just spending time with people, hanging out, playing, making love, making music. These things are not high carbon intensive things. Often resource intensive activities have to do with you being in situations where you have very little time, so you need to do things very, very quickly. So, for example, if we built a society where we can have more communal food production and consumption together in community, that literally decreases the amount of resources you need to make food. Instead of having everyone in atomized kitchens cooking separately for one person or for two people, literally having communal experiences of food reduces resource and energy use. But we need to start talking. I think solar punk does this really beautifully, is to try and put at the forefront, literally, what does this look like for people's bodies, for people's experiences of the world? And I think, the labor of getting people to tap into their imagination, which at the end of the day is very realistic in the sense that we have this deeply sacred life world inside of our own minds. We are an other to ourselves. We have this other imagination in us constantly, which can be beautiful and also difficult. All the voices in our head, that constant theater that we have. But we need to tap into people's own internal experiences of the world and to show to them that on the other side of the mindset of fear is a mindset of possibilities, a mindset of just incredible things happening. And I come back to, Salvador Minuchin was a very famous Argentine psychotherapist, and almost he gave this very interesting definition of psychotherapy as the introduction of uncertainty into the space of someone's mind, right? If you have particular stories that have this huge kind of stranglehold over you, what therapy can help you do, and therapy of all kinds, right? It doesn't have to be one particular modality. It can help almost bring a bit of oxygen, a bit of uncertainty to try and give a bit of space for that story to loosen its grip. And I think that's also almost what our labor, I think, has to be, is to, what is the oxygen that we can bring to people? What is the uncertainty that isn't anxiety just inducing all the time, but an uncertainty which allows you to get into touch with possibility, with your ancestors, but also with possibility of your life or futures. I'm drawn to that work now of like therapeutic possibility.
I think like part of what we're talking about is the process of commoning, like literally creating the commons. And again, the through line of this conversation is, I think one of the arguments that we're making, or the core arguments, is how common all of these things are, and how to a significant extent, no one or very few people actively disagree with that premise.
Yeah.
And so we understand, for example, I live in Geneva, right? Or in Barcelona, let's say, or in Paris, or whatever, in cities that are privileged enough, unfortunately, because those are the frameworks, that's the world we live in. that has very good public transportation, right? A very basic, or should be very basic thing that is not actually as basic as widespread as it should be. And because I've experienced good public transportation, I know for a fact that a tram and a bus and a train is better than a car. I know this very easily because I see it every day. I see the 1,000 people going in those 2, 3, 4 trams from one place to the other. If they were converted into 1,000 cars or in 800 cars or whatever, I know what that looks like because I know Beirut, and that's what Beirut looks like. So I have those two contrasts in mind, and what I know between those two is I can then contrast and compare and contrast the anxiety that I would feel getting in a car in Beirut and having to calculate ahead of time and all of that stuff with just sitting in a tram and being able to read a book, for example, and still making that same distance, right? So it's not just that it's more efficient, but it is in many ways more enjoyable, or it can be more enjoyable. You mentioned time poverty. I wanted to pin this because I think a part of the trying to make these very difficult things that we're talking about, or can seem very difficult, make them easier to digest, make them more playful, make them just more approachable. A is because I hate the elitism of certain academic discourses and whatnot, but B is because we need that. We quite literally need to make everyone, ourselves included, feel that we can actually change the world, right? Like it's a belief at the end of the day. We know this paradox that, well, if all 8 billion people in the world believe the same thing, maybe reality can change. So we know that, we kind of feel that way, but like, how do we do that, right? And of course, it doesn't mean that we need one vision, and that's part of the pluriverse approach, right? But I think there's an argument to be made that many folks, and I'm not gonna say I'm divorced from that, I think myself included to a significant extent, something I've been working on, are afraid of that change. Right, we're afraid of change in general. And that's why I love like Octavia Butler's the beginning of the parable of the sower. Like the only constant is change. God is change. Right, like that's part of that novel. The beginning of, I think, the very first paragraph. And I think it becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Right, we know the life we live in. Right, there's a routine maybe in many cases. It becomes something that it's easier to just kind of lower your head a bit, don't complicate things, don't rock the boat, right? It's easier to not rock the boat and just wait until the boat reaches a certain destination, or at least you tell yourself that. And when you reach that destination, maybe you can take a different boat, right? Like you can have that thing. And unfortunately, what ends up happening is that the boat is just our entire lives, right? And that's part of the problem. It's not the entire problem. It's part of the problem. And that's what I mean, or what we mean, I think. We agree on this. When we say like imagination is really important. And solar punk, among other punks and among other topias and among other utopias, and among other genres, it's not just that. Afrofuturism can do that, allows us to expand the realm of what is considered realistic. And I emphasize the term realistic because I think we need to kind of hit the realism where it hurts the most, in some sense. Because I think, again, most people in the discourse that we usually have within the English language, let's say, although it translates relatively well in other languages, would agree that these things are good, are nice. Utopia, cool, nice. I mean, by definition, almost, right? And happiness, that's a nice thing. Play is a nice thing. All of these things are associated with positive feelings, but they are not realistic. And the contention I think we should be making is that realism is not realistic.
Yeah.
Realism, what we think of as realism, doesn't actually exist. It's not, as we said, we know this for a fact, a scientific fact now, that the world in which we live in is heading towards catastrophe. If it's heading towards catastrophe, it cannot, by definition, be realistic. It cannot be the best way to approach the world we live in, given that we are breaking it. And so you see, there's a link. You can play between like The Office and talking about the apocalypse and solar punk and capitalism and liberation, because at the end of the day, this is in the realm of the imagination, and that's what is meant, or that's what I mean, and others, folks, and yourself as well, mean by actually valuing imagination rather than accepting the divorce that happens at some point in our lives between imagination and memory, realistic, unrealistic, all of these things, right? And this isn't rocket science. Like, folks have been doing this. This is what when the best kinds of indigenous politics have been talking about this for quite some time now. This is what Harriet Tubman herself mentioned, as you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, that there has to be a vision of liberation in order to. I think, if I remember, I think it's her who said this, that a part of how she was able to persuade enslaved people to leave is to tell them that there is something better on the other side. Because a difficulty, obviously, is not that enslaved folks did not know that slavery is bad. Obviously, they knew this. It was just very difficult to believe that there is something better anywhere else. And obviously, a good part of that is because there wasn't anything better anywhere else, at least nothing reachable, nothing feasible for them to do so, because they were trapped in that horrific situation. And she was the one who was able to show them through action, through quote unquote violence, right? That there is actually a better way out of that. That there is a way out of that situation. And obviously, she did what she could. She wasn't able to help free everyone, of course, but that's why she's, I think, one of the badass people in history. But yeah.
Absolutely. But I think, that there's so much. I think there's so many places to move that are like talking about the imagination. I think is unifying. I think it allows us to speak to people where they're at and to build political conversations, not from the place of convincing people, but from really, asking someone, what is it that you care about? What is it that you aspire towards? Like, what are your deprivations? What do you crave for? And, I don't want to be too romantic about what it means to talk, this kind of like, quote unquote, talk politically across the spectrum, or how to talk to others. I think that there's a lot of stuff that I think is very problematic with that discourse. But I think the imagination can be very unifying in a way that other things can't be. And it allows us to speak in ways that I think, there's a beautiful poem by Yehuda Amichai, which is like, from the place, which I'm going to paraphrase the poem, but it's like, it's called From the Place That We Are Right. And it's like, from the place that we are right, very little can grow. But the place that we're unsure, the place that we're wrong, the place that we don't know is fertile. Is all things can grow. And I think so. I think there's lessons in terms of movement building of what we can do there. But I also think there's just a broader invitation towards just moving beyond seriousness. Eduardo Galeano has this beautiful kind of essay called The Right to Dream, which is often translated as The Right to Utopia. And he has this kind of utopic reflection on all the transformations going to happen in the world. And one of them is like, God is going to do an edit of the 10 Commandments. One of them will be edited, and it will be, there will be a new edition, which will be, you will love nature that you are part of. And another one, different prohibitions on the body, will be edited to say, you will love your body because it is a carnivore. And I think just these invitations towards ecological belonging, but also towards somatic love and somatic, like putting the body on the table, which so many incredible feminist movements have done, and beginning to think about ways in which we can, as Galeano says, stop making solemnity into a virtue and to start dealing with play as a political principle. I think that the imagination helps us go there. It helps us tell stories. It helps us just become more fun and more humane, more accessible to folks. I think, if anything, that academic theorizing does is just literally just evacuates all kind of play or often accessibility from the conversation. So I'm excited that I didn't think that we'd end up speaking about play, but I'm excited. I think it's telling that we did.
It is. I think so. I mean, I tend to, as you know, by now, I tend to like quoting James Baldwin.
Of course.
And there's one, what was it? Let me remember. He was asked, like, do you have hope, right? And he responded something along the lines, people can find it, it's on YouTube, like, I have to have hope, because not having hope is kind of accepting that life is an academic matter. I.e. that life is just something to disconnect from, that there is no point in changing things and whatnot, that, again, it would be unrealistic, right, quote unquote. And I find that very powerful. And he has this other thing, we talked about time, right? He has this brilliant intervention at some point, like he was asked, like there's been a lot of improvements at the time they would say for the Negro, for the African American, in our lifetime. It was like the 50s, 1950s, right? You can immediately see as soon as that question was asked that he was angry at the question, James Baldwin. And then at some point he responded something along the lines of like, how much time do you need? Because he was saying like, it's already taken the time of my father, my grandfather, my mother, my sister, my niece. It's taken all of our time. How much more time do you need for your progress? And that's how he put it. And that's kind of the issue, right? I mean, that was specifically in his context, of course, and it was in the context of the civil rights movement at the time in the US and so on. But that sentiment is a pretty generalized one. Like, how much more time, from the perspective of an indigenous activist, an elder, let's say, who for them being realistic is actually to look at the 15th century as the time when the apocalypse started, the 1492 as the beginning of the apocalypse. How much more time are the rest of us, I'm kind of simplifying a bit, gonna take in order to understand that the apocalypse is not just what we are currently experiencing, but many peoples around the world have already experienced an apocalypse, slavery as an apocalypse, indigenous struggles as resisting an apocalypse, abolitionism as resisting an apocalypse, etc., etc. All of these things. Time is not something to just take for granted, right? It's something that needs to be acted upon, and sometimes it has to be broken, it has to be actively challenged, has to be bended in a certain way and whatnot. And I think it's one of the through lines of this conversation. Now, all of that being said, we need to find some bizarre way of wrapping up, because that's going to be difficult. But I think this conversation sort of shows that, and something I enjoy doing with you especially, that we would start with one thing and then end up somewhere I have no idea how we ended up in. But what this kind of tells us as well is that we'll have these different chapters in this conversation, and maybe one day we can explore different chapters more in depth and whatnot. But so I'll kind of leave you to have the final reflection, share whatever you want to share. And then, or you can do this at the same time if you want, go through the 3-book recommendation that I ask all guests to do at the end of an episode. So take it from there.
Thank you so much, Joey. I just super honored and humbled to be here, to be in a space that so many incredible people that I admire have been in also before. And to me, we've been on so many threads, but to me also that's deeply ecological. I mean, ecology is about all the connections that sustain the world. And I think from a spiritual perspective, at least the spiritual background that I come from, there's a deep belief that, you can look at anything in the world and see the whole of the world in that little thing. So I think it's being lost or finding our way through very, very messy conversations is just a form of precision, I think. So I'm grateful to have such spacious conversations with you. I'm invited, so I think I'm going to bring three books that I think that have come to me just in this conversation. I wanted to ask if it's possible to give 4 or 5, but I think there's a rule of 3.
Yeah.
There's a rule of 3.
There's no rule.
I would start with the incredible philosopher Ailton Krenak. I don't know how much there is translated into English from Ailton Krenak, but I think in English it would be Ideas for the End of the World. Ideas to postpone the end of the world. Probably better in English. But Ailton Krenak is a Krenak indigenous philosopher from the land of Brazil, and just is an incredible thinker for our times. Like one of the top 5 people I would recommend and understand how to think and dethrone what he calls the mentality of devouring. The colonial mentality is a mentality of devouring. And also to understand that there's a beautiful reflection that Krenak gives, that I'll just share here because I think it's unmissable, but it's like, Krenak's reflections that white people are obsessed with books because they are steeped in a culture of oblivion. And oral memory is so important to also value, not just books, and how we maintain stories alive. I would go also then, so Ailton Krenak, Ideas to Postpone the End of the World. There's an incredible book called Undrowned, Black Feminist Lessons from Marine Mammals by Alexis Pauline Gumbs. This is one of the most just spirit-blowing, instead of mind-blowing, just incredible books that I've read recently. It's a love letter of a book, and it's a book of political teaching of marine biology and of poetry at the same time. And I think it's incredible. It's a beautiful, beautiful confluence, and to me is a compass of what writing in this times look like. And I think maybe more in the political kind of tapping into the reason side of things a bit more. There's a really beautiful book called How the World Breaks by Paul and Stan Cox, father and son. And I think it's almost like a analysis, anthropological, but also political analysis of a bunch of vignettes of situations, mainly of climate violence, but also of other kinds of disasters around the world, and also how it's a window, I think, into what real disaster looks like on the ground from a very sober perspective of both the hope and the solidarity that's built, but also what disaster capitalism looks like in the 21st century. And so I think it's a good, interesting window into prospects for what the century could look like, what we can need to be aware of, and what we can resist. So that's how the world breaks. And then just final recommendations. To me, poetry is an indispensable tool of teaching for me. And I think some poets from our times that I would very much recommend would be three: Joy Harjo, Ilya Kaminsky, and Dunya Mikhail. All of them bring, I think, a capacity of listening and of attention to the world that I think is indispensable. So I stay with them.
Thanks for that. And as always, the recommendations that the guest has, I'll put them in the show notes and in the description. Okay, Daniel. I mean, all that's left for me to do is thank you for this amazing conversation. And as I mentioned before, I think we've basically created like 8 other episodes for the future. We'll see how that goes. But yeah, thanks a lot for that.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for your incredible mind and openness as always.
The Fire These Times is hosted by myself, Joey Ayoub. I am also its producer, researcher, writer, and sound editor. If you want to help turn this project into a full-time job, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes to support it. These episodes are part of a bigger project which includes resources, a newsletter, and eventually YouTube video essays as well. As always, thank you for listening and take care.